They looked at a king and saw a monster. And they looked at a queen and saw a maid.
Welcome to the Cowboy Heartweaver. Today we share a story of healing and truly sees the heart. Let us begin.
The transition from the sprawling, brutal expanse of the open prairie to the suffocating interior of the Ironwood main house was absolute and immediate. The heavy oak front door, banded with black iron, groaned shut behind Evelina with a sound like a sealing tomb. The heavy clack of the iron deadbolt sliding into place severed the final sliver of pale moonlight, plunging the foyer into a darkness so dense it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. Outside, the wind had been a howling, living entity, biting at her cheeks and tearing at her frayed shawl, but inside this cavernous space the air was entirely stagnant. It smelled of cold hearths, settled dust, ancient, unpolished cedar, and an overwhelming, crushing loneliness. Beside her, in the pitch black, Evelina could feel the looming, monumental presence of Harlan Vance. He was a furnace of pure masculine heat in the freezing room, his breathing a steady, low rhythmic sound that seemed to synchronize with the ominous ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the unseen gloom. Suddenly, the rustle of heavy canvas shifted. Harlan's large, calloused hand moved toward her in the dark. Evelina flinched. It was a sharp, violent, and entirely instinctive jerk of her broad shoulders. Her muscles coiled tighter than wire, a movement born from 22 years of dodging cruel slaps, warding off shoved shoulders in crowded hallways, and enduring the sudden vicious strikes of the innkeeper's broom handle. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her arms inward, desperately trying to make her large frame smaller, bracing for a harsh grip on her arm or a cold, snarling command to get down on her knees and start scrubbing the floorboards. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic trapped bird battering itself against the cage of her chest. Instead of a blow, the sharp metallic clink of a glass lantern chimney echoed in the silence. A match struck against boot leather. The sharp, pungent, sulphurous hiss cut fiercely through the stale air. A tiny, defiant spark bloomed between Harlan's thick fingers, rapidly growing into a warm, flickering amber flame. He wasn't looking at her with anger. He wasn't looking at her with the predatory, drunken hunger she had seen in the eyes of the cowboys back in Oakhaven. As the golden light washed over his rugged, shadowed features, all Evelina saw was a profound, quiet patience. He was merely holding out the lit lantern, holding it high to cast a protective circle of light over her trembling form. Before we witness how the most feared man in the territory carefully dismantles Evelina's walls of fear, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city below. Let's see how far this story travels. Hold this, Harlan said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated deep in the floorboards and travelled straight up through the soles of Evelina's worn boots. The stairs are steep, the wood is dry, and it's prone to catching a stray heel in the dark. Evelina reached out, her fingers trembling so violently that the wire handle of the lantern rattled against the glass. As she took it from him, her knuckles briefly brushed against the rough, scarred leather of his riding glove. The contact was instantaneous, a startling localized spark of heat, but his grip remained as steady and unyielding as a mountain. She held the lantern aloft, the amber light dancing across the grand, neglected foyer. Everything in the house was built for a giant. The sweeping staircase was monstrously wide, the banisters carved from thick, dark walnut that seemed to swallow the light rather than reflect it. Walk quietly, her mind screamed at her. Do not take up space, do not make a sound. As she followed Harlan up the groaning wooden stairs, every step felt precarious. She was acutely aware of her own weight, terrified that the sheer heaviness of her footfalls would somehow anger the man leading the way. This was, after all, the lair of the monster of Ironwood. In the dusty, gossip-filled corners of Oakhaven, Harlan Vance was a myth of terrifying proportions. They whispered that he had a heart made of jagged flint and a soul that had withered to ash in the harsh prairie sun. Men claimed he had broken wild horses verkepte at his bare hands and run off dozens of hardened ranch hands for the slightest infraction. And the women the cruel parasol twirling, women of the town, had sneered that the only reason a wealthy, powerful man like him would buy a fat, useless lump like Evelina was because no respectable woman would ever agree to endure his legendary coldness. They said she was brought here to be a pack mule, a creature meant to be worked to the bone and discarded when she inevitably collapsed. Evelina clutched the lantern handle so hard the metal bit painfully into her flesh. She was waiting for the terrifying rumors to materialize. She was waiting for the moment this surreal, quiet transaction would turn into the nightmare she had been promised. Yet as she watched Harlan's broad back ascend the stairs ahead of her, she noticed he was intentionally shortening his long strides. He was matching his pace to hers, ensuring she didn't fall behind in the dark. His silver spurs, which normally jingled with an aggressive, intimidating cadence in the town square, were deliberately muffled as he walked. He was moving through his own fortress, kept a hushed reverence, leaving Evelina trapped in an agonizing, terrifying state of suspense, wondering when the monster would finally reveal his teeth. The second-floor landing of the Ironwood main house stretched out before them, an echoing cavern of dark wood and imposing shadows. As Evelina stepped off the final stair, her worn leather boots made a soft scuffing sound against the wide, unvarnished floorboards. The amber light from the lantern Harlan carried spilled down the long corridor, revealing a space that was aggressively, undeniably masculine. There were no softening touches here, no woven rugs to muffle the footsteps, no delicate lace doilies resting on side tables, no painted portraits staring down from the walls. It was a space stripped entirely of sentimentality, built solely for endurance and utility. For her entire life, Evelina's size had been her greatest, most unforgivable sin. She was too broad, too heavy, taking up space in a world that demanded women be small, delicate, and easily swept aside. In the cramped, rotting hallways of the Oakhaven boarding house, she had constantly bruised her hips against narrow door frames and drawn cruel sneers for making the floorboards groan. She had spent 22 years folding herself inward, hunching her strong shoulders, perpetually apologizing for her very existence. But here, in the heart of Harlan Vance domain, the architecture mocked her ingrained trauma. The ceilings were vaulted and high, the corridor wide enough for 3 large men to walk abreast. Yet, out of pure, terrifying habit, Evelina immediately pressed herself against the wall. Her shoulder scraped against the rough grain of the dark timber paneling as she walked, desperately trying to make herself invisible in a house that could easily swallow her whole. Harlan walked a few paces ahead. His movements were fluid, possessing a predatory yet profoundly controlled grace that seemed impossible for a man of his colossal size. The silver spurs on his boots, which normally jingled with an aggressive, intimidating cadence in the town square, were deliberately muffled as he moved, a subtle adjustment that Evelina's hyper-vigilant mind struggled to comprehend. Her mind raced, a frantic spiral of dark, terrifying assumptions. What does a monster do with a wife he bought out of the dirt? The sharp, glass-like voice of the innkeeper echoed in her ears. No man wants to marry a girl with a waistline thicker than a rain barrel. She assumed with absolute, crushing certainty that Harlan found her repulsive. She assumed this marriage was purely a utilitarian nightmare, a contract signed to secure a glorified pack mule who would scrub his floors and butcher his hogs until she collapsed. She fully expected him to lead her to a cramped servants' quarters, perhaps a drafty, windowless closet at the back of the house with a thin, flea-bitten pallet thrown onto the floor. She watched the broad, immovable wall of Harlan's back, enveloped in the heavy canvas duster. The scent of him drifted back to her, a rich, intoxicating and terrifying blend of sharp pine needles, gun oil, worn saddle leather, and the cold, raw ozone of the prairie wind. It was the scent of absolute power. It was the scent of a man who owned everything he surveyed, including her. They passed 3 heavy, solid oak doors along the corridor. Evelina held her breath as they approached each one, a shudder of genuine terror rippling through her heavy frame. Behind which of those impenetrable doors did the monster sleep? Would he demand she cross his threshold tonight? She had no concept of intimacy, only the brutal, bruising, non-consensual realities she had witnessed among the drunken, violent patrons of the tavern back in Oakhaven. The thought of this massive, formidable stranger demanding his husbandly rights made a cold sweat break out at the base of her neck. Her physical exhaustion began to compound her fear. Her heels were blistering inside the stiff boots. The cheap, poorly boned corset beneath her faded bodice was chafing her ribs kept a hat every shallow breath she took. A desperate, arid thirst clung to the back of her throat, thick with the dust of the day's travel, but she dared not speak. She dared not ask the master of Ironwood for a drop of water. Suddenly, Harlan stopped. The abrupt cessation of his heavy boots against the floorboards made Evelina freeze instantly. She locked her knees, her heart slamming against her sternum. They were standing before the final door on the right side of the hall. Harlan did not turn around immediately. He stood facing the dark, heavy wood of the door, his massive silhouette a solid void against the flickering amber light of the lantern. Evelina gripped her frayed shawl tighter around her broad shoulders, pressing her back flush against the wall, waiting for the harsh command, the cruel sneer, the beginning of her new, terrifying reality. Instead, Harlan slowly reached out his calloused hand, his thick fingers wrapping around the cold iron of the doorknob. The heavy iron latch clicked with a resounding metallic snap that echoed down the cavernous hallway. The hinges, surprisingly well oiled and silent, offered no resistance as Harlan pushed the heavy oak door inward. Evelina braced herself, her thick fingers curled desperately into the frayed rough yarn of her shawl. She locked her knees, fully prepared to step into a freezing, windowless cell, a dusty storage room, or a drafty attic space deemed suitable for a woman of her size and non-existent status. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, fortifying the iron walls around her heart, ready to accept her new, miserable reality. But the reality of Ironwood did not meet her expectations. Instead of the biting chill of a neglected servant's quarter, a sudden glorious wave of radiant heat washed over her face. It was physical and immediate, a tangible force that rolled out of the room and physically pushed back the oppressive cold of the hallway. The air inside was not stale or suffocating. It was thick with the rich, intoxicating scent of burning pion wood, the clean, crisp aroma of lye-washed linens, and the faint, savoury, mouth-watering smell of roasted meat. Evelina's eyes snapped open. The harsh amber light of Harlan's lantern was suddenly unnecessary. The room before her was bathed in the warm, dancing, golden glow of a massive fire. It was not a closet. It was a sprawling, sweeping bedchamber that rivaled the grandest suites at the Oakhaven Hotel, rooms she had only ever been permitted to see while scrubbing their floors on her hands and knees. Dominating the space was a colossal four-poster bed crafted from dark, polished mahogany, its mattress thick and inviting, draped in heavy, intricately stitched woolen quilts of deep crimson and indigo. A massive stone hearth occupied the far wall, where logs the size of Evelina's thighs crackled and popped, meticulously arranged to sustain a deep, penetrating heat through the bitter prairie night. In the corner sat a beautifully carved oak washstand. Upon it rested a large, pristine porcelain bowl and a matching pitcher that was currently radiating thick ribbons of fragrant white steam into the cool air. Beside it, on a small, sturdy side table, sat a covered tin plate and a thick ceramic mug, the source of the savoury aroma that was making Evelina's starved stomach twist in sudden, violent hunger. Evelina stood frozen on the threshold, her broad frame entirely blocking the doorway. Her dark eyes, wide and completely unguarded, darted from the roaring fire to the steaming water, and finally to the covered plate of food. Her mind, so accustomed to cruelty, violently rejected what her eyes were seeing. "It's a trick," a terrified voice whispered in her head. "A cruel joke. He is going to laugh and point you to the stables." In Oakhaven, a warm fire and a hot meal were things dangled in front of her only to be snatched away for the amusement of others. She waited for the punchline. She waited for the monster to reveal his teeth. But Harlan Vance did not laugh. He did not push past her, nor did he issue a harsh command to get to work. He simply stepped back. He moved his massive frame out of the doorway, melting into the shadows of the hallway, intentionally creating a wide physical distance between them. He gave her space, a concept so foreign to Evelina that it left her entirely disoriented. He held the lantern high, its light catching the sharp patrician lines of his jaw and the fathomless icy blue depths of his eyes. "The water is hot," Harlan said, his low, gravelly baritone cutting through the crackle of the fire. His tone was entirely devoid of emotion, a pure, pragmatic statement of fact. "There is clean, thick flannel in the armoire. The plate has salt pork and bread. Eat it." Evelina swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. She looked from the steaming pitcher to the towering man in the shadows. He wasn't demanding gratitude. He wasn't demanding anything at all. He looked down at her. He didn't look at her heavy waist, her broad shoulders, or her ruined, dusty dress with the disgust she expected. He looked directly into her dark, terrified eyes with absolute, unwavering focus. There is a heavy iron bolt on the inside of this door. Evelina, Harlan continued, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, carrying a solemn weight that made her breath hitch in her chest. When Mort close it, you throw the bolt. No one enters this room without your permission. Not the hands and not me. Do you understand? The sheer magnitude of his words crashed over her like a physical wave. Not even me. He was giving her a fortress. He was giving her the ultimate unprecedented luxury that a woman of her standing had never possessed. The right to safety. The right to say no. Evelina could not speak. The lump in her throat was the size of a fist, a painful knot of unshed tears and profound shattering shock. She could only manage a jerky, trembling nod, her wide eyes locked onto his. Harlan gave a single, curt nod in return. He reached for the heavy brass handle of the door. "Good night, Evelina," he murmured. And with a soft, definitive click, the monster of ironwood closed the door, leaving the heavy, unwanted girl entirely alone in a sanctuary of warmth, safety, and absolute, wordless respect. The heavy oak door stood as a silent sentinel before her. For a long, agonizing minute, Evelina did not move. She simply stared at the thick grain of the wood, listening intently. She half expected the sudden, violent turn of the handle, the heavy, demanding knock, the harsh voice telling her the charade was over and ordering her to the stables. But the only sound that reached her ears was the steady, rhythmic retreat of Harlan's boots down the corridor, growing fainter until they were entirely swallowed by the vast, cavernous silence of the house. She was truly entirely alone. Slowly, her thick, trembling fingers reached out. She grasped the heavy iron bolt Harlan had pointed out. The metal was cold against her skin, a stark, grounding contrast to the radiant heat of the room. With a firm, deliberate push, she slid it into the strike plate. Clack. The sound was definitive. It was the sound of a drawbridge being raised, of an impenetrable fortress being sealed. For 22 years, Evelina's life had been entirely accessible to the cruel whims of others. She had slept in cramped quarters with broken latches, in drafty corners where drunken men could stumble, where the innkeeper could burst in off any hour to kick her awake and demand labour. She had never known the profound, absolute luxury of a locked door. She leaned her broad forehead against the solid oak, letting out a breath she felt she had been holding since she left Oakhaven. Her knees suddenly ep-alerty weak, the adrenaline draining from her thick thighs, leaving her trembling and hollow. Turning around, she finally allowed herself to truly look at the sanctuary Harlan Vance had provided. The fire in the massive stone hearth crackled merrily, spitting tiny orange embers that died before they reached the woven rug. The heat was a physical embrace, slowly thawing the deep, aching chill that had settled into her bones during the long, terrifying wagon ride. She walked toward the hearth, her boots leaving faint, dusty prints on the floorboards, and stripped off her frayed woolen shawl. She let it drop to a nearby chair, the first shedding of her old, suffocating life. Her gaze drifted to the small side table. The savoury, rich scent of the roasted meat pulled at her senses with an aggressive, primal demand. Her stomach cramped violently. She hadn't eaten since a meagre crust of stale bread at dawn, too paralysed by fear and humiliation to feel her own hunger. Evelina approached the table. With a shaking hand, she lifted the tin cover. Beneath it lay a thick, generous slab of roasted salt pork, glistening with its own savoury juices, resting beside half a loaf of dense, crusty bread and a small crock of freshly churned butter. Beside the plate was a heavy ceramic mug, warm to the touch, filled with dark, heavily sweetened tea. There was no one to watch her, no one to snicker and call her a glutton, no one to slap her hand away and tell her to wait until the paying customers had finished their meals. She picked up the bread, breaking it with her strong hands. She didn't sit in the delicate, dainty manner demanded of parlour ladies. She stood by the fire, bathed in its golden light, and ate with genuine, unapologetic hunger. The pork was rich and intensely savoury, the hot fat melting on her tongue, instantly restoring the energy the brutal day had stolen from her. The sweet hot tea washed down the choking dust of the prairie, soothing her raw, parched throat. It was the most magnificent meal of her life, seasoned not just with salt and smoke, but with the astonishing, intoxicating flavour of dignity. When the plate was completely clean, Evelina moved to the carved washstand. The porcelain pitcher was still radiating thick ribbons of steam. She poured the water into the deep bowl. It was hot, pristine, and smelled faintly of pure lye and crushed lavender. She looked down at her hands, calloused broad and caked in the grey grit of Oakhaven. Then she reached for the buttons of her faded, ill-fitting grey bodice. The fabric had always been too tight across her broad shoulders, a constant physical reminder that she took up too much space in a world that demanded smallness. Her thick fingers fumbled with the cheap bone buttons, finally pulling the restrictive garment off and dropping it beside her shawl. Beneath it lay her corset. It was a cheap, rigid contraption she had bought second-hand, entirely unsuited for her substantial, powerful frame. It dug viciously into her ribs and pinched her waist, a brutal instrument of societal conformity that left her constantly breathless. With a deep, shuddering sigh, she unlaced it, pulling the heavy strings until the stiff canvas gave way. She let the corset fall to the floor with a heavy, satisfying thud. Freed from its punishing grip, Evelina took a massive, profound breath. Her lungs expanded fully, her chest rising, her thick, powerful ribs flaring outward without restriction. She ran her hands over her cotton chemise, feeling the deep, red indentations the boning had left on her skin. Here, in the absolute privacy of this locked room, her size was not a sin. Her broadness was not a burden to be hidden. She was simply a woman breathing freely in a space entirely her own. She dipped a washcloth into the steaming water, the heat sinking blissfully into her tired muscles, and slowly, methodically began to wash away the dust, the grime, and the lingering, suffocating shame of the town she had left behind forever. The steaming water in the porcelain basin quickly turned murky, absorbing the physical evidence of Evelina's humiliating departure from Oakhaven. She washed her face, scrubbing roughly at her cheeks until the skin was pink and tingling, purging the lingering traces of the innkeeper's spit and the dusty sneers of the townsfolk. She unpinned her heavy, dark hair, letting it tumble in thick, unruly waves down her strong back. The simple act of brushing it out, feeling the tangles surrender to the bristles, felt profoundly luxurious in the quiet solitude of the locked room. Once she felt clean, Evelina moved toward the massive armoire Harlan had mentioned. The heavy oak doors swung open smoothly, revealing an expanse of empty space waiting to be filled. But on the lowest shelf, neatly folded, sat a thick, pristine stack of ivory flannel. She lifted the fabric. It was a nightgown vast and billowing, entirely lacking the jehati lace and restrictive cuts of the garments she was used to. It smelled fiercely of the prairie wind and cedar, devoid of any floral perfumes. She slipped it over her head, the thick, heavy flannel cascading over her broad shoulders and draping perfectly over her full hips, reaching all the way to the floorboards. It was shockingly warm, designed not for seduction or display, but for pure, uncompromising comfort against the biting cold of a frontier night. It was yet another silent, pragmatic gesture of respect from a man who seemingly noticed everything. Evelina turned her attention to the colossal four-poster bed. She peeled back the heavy crimson and indigo quilts. The linens beneath were crisp and cool, smelling faintly of lavender. She hesitated for a moment, her ingrained trauma fighting a brief, losing battle against her utter exhaustion. She was so unaccustomed to softness. She was a woman built for hard labor, meant to sleep on thin pallets or lumpy horsehair mattresses. To slip into this magnificent bed felt almost sacrilegious, an indulgence she surely hadn't earned. But the fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, inviting glow over the pillows. With a deep, shuddering sigh, Evelina climbed into the bed. The mattress groaned softly, but it did not sag beneath her substantial weight. It cradled her perfectly. She pulled the heavy quilts up to her chin. The weight of the blankets was immensely comforting, a grounding, physical pressure that made her feel incredibly safe. She lay perfectly still, her dark eyes staring at the canopy above, watching the firelight dance across the dark mahogany. The profound silence of Ironwood, which had felt so terrifying and oppressive just an hour ago, now felt like a thick protective blanket. She could hear the wind howling outside, throwing its icy breath against the thick window panes, but the storm could not touch her. The heavy oak door was bolted from the inside. Yet sleep did not come easily. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The sharp, cruel voices of Oakhaven, "You great useless lump, a monster's bride," Shelo et hadede violently with the reality she was experiencing. Harlan Vance, the supposed monster of Ironwood, had thrown a fortune in gold to pull her from the dirt. He had treated her not as a burden, but as a crucial necessity. He had fed her, provided her with a sanctuary, and then walked away, offering her the ultimate respect of a bolted door. Why, the question echoed endlessly in her mind. Why would a man who commanded an empire, a man who moved with such lethal, terrifying grace, show such profound, wordless kindness to a woman the world had deemed entirely unlovable? Evelina rolled onto her side, burying her face into the lavender-scented pillow. She did have the answer. But as the immense, exhausted weight of the day finally pulled her under, succumbing to the deep, dreamless sleep she so desperately needed, one truth remained absolute. Tomorrow at sunrise she would wake up in this bed. She would walk down those stairs. And she would begin to prove to Harlan Vance, the man who had given her a locked door, exactly what the woman inside that room was truly capable of. Evelina plummeted into sleep like a stone thrown into a deep, dark well. Her body, utterly depleted by the emotional and physical brutality of the day, demanded surrender. Yet 22 years of living in a perpetual state of hypervigilance could not be entirely erased in a single night. Sometime in the fathomless, pitch-black hours before dawn, her eyes snapped open. She lay perfectly still, her breath caught in the back of her throat, her heart instantly kicking into a frantic, hammering rhythm against her ribs. The massive bedroom was submerged in deep shadow. The roaring fire had burned down to a pile of glowing, pulsing embers, casting a faint blood-orange illumination across the hearthrug, but leaving the corners of the room in absolute darkness. The air had grown sharply cold, biting at the tip of her nose, though her body remained blissfully warm beneath the heavy crimson and indigo quilts. What had woken her? She strained her ears, filtering past the low, mournful howling of the prairie wind rattling the thick window panes, and then she heard it. Scrape, a low, muffled grunt of exertion. It was coming from the hallway, right outside her bedroom door. A cold, paralyzing terror washed over Evelina, turning her blood to ice. The ghosts of Oakhaven instantly flooded her mind. She remembered the terrifying, suffocating panic of lying on her thin pallet at the boarding house, listening to the heavy, drunken footsteps of the patrons stumbling down the hall. She remembered the aggressive rattling of her flimsy doorknob, the slurred, cruel demands for entry, the sheer terror of knowing her body was the only barricade between her and a nightmare. He is trying to come in, her panicked mind screamed. The monster has changed his mind. Evelina threw off the heavy quilts. The freezing night air hit her, but she didn't shiver. The thick flannel nightgown Harlan had provided draped heavily around her broad frame, absorbing the chill. Her large bare feet hit the floorboards. For a woman of her substantial size and weight, she moved with shocking, absolute silence, a tragic, ingrained survival tactic learned from a lifetime of trying to be invisible. She crept across the expanse of the dark room, her dark eyes fixed on the heavy oak door. The heavy iron bolt was still securely in place, exactly as she had left it. She reached the door and carefully, breathlessly, pressed her ear against the cold, unyielding wood. On the other side of the oak she heard the unmistakable, steady, rhythmic breathing of Harlan Vance. He was terrifyingly close. The faint, sharp scent of gun oil, beeswax, and his distinctly masculine warmth seemed to seep right through the microscopic cracks in the timber. Evelina squeezed her eyes shut, bracing her thick palms against the door, fully expecting him to test the handle, to demand that she throw the bolt and let him claim the rights of a husband who had purchased a bride. Instead, a soft metallic tap vibrated through the wood directly into her ear. Scrape, squeak. He wasn't touching the handle, he was working on the hinges. Evelina frowned in the dark, her panic faltering, replaced by a profound, bewildering confusion. She held her breath, listening intently to the microscopic sounds. She heard the deliberate, careful turn of a heavy screwdriver. She heard the soft application of oil. She realized with a sudden, staggering clarity what had happened. Earlier, when the fierce prairie wind had battered the side of the house, the heavy door had rattled infinitesimally in its frame. It was a minute sound, one she had barely registered over her own exhaustion. But Harlan had heard it. And instead of sleeping in his own quarters, the master of the 1,000-acre empire was out in the freezing dark corridor in the middle of the night. He was not trying to dismantle her barricade. He was tightening the screws on the strike plate. He was oiling the heavy iron hinges so the wind wouldn't disturb her rest. He was fortifying the walls of her sanctuary. Evelina slid down the smooth face of the oak door, her broad back pressing against the wood until she hit the floorboards. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her thick arms around her legs, enveloped in the heavy folds of the flannel nightgown. She sat there in the dark, feeling the vibrations of his careful, silent labor through the wood at her back. In Oakhaven, men broke doors down. They shattered boundaries and invaded spaces with a violent, entitled cruelty. But here, the man they called a monster was spending his night in the freezing dark, meticulously ensuring that the lock keeping him out was absolutely impenetrable. A single hot tear escaped her eye, sliding down her cheek to drop onto the flannel covering her knee. The terrifying, suffocating knot of fear that had lived in her chest since she was a little girl began to loosen, unspooling in the quiet dark. She rested the back of her head against the door, separated from the most formidable man in the territory by merely an inch of wood, and for the very first time in her 22 years on Earth, Evelina felt profoundly, terrifyingly cherished. The soft metallic sounds from the hallway eventually ceased. The heavy floorboards creaked once, a distinct sound of a massive weight shifting, followed by the slow, muffled retreat of Harlan's boots. He didn't go to the room next door. The footsteps faded entirely, descending the grand staircase and disappearing into the cavernous belly of the house. Evelina remained seated on the floor, her back pressed against the fortified oak door. The frantic, hammering rhythm of her heart had smoothed out into a deep, steady thrum. For a long while she just listened to the absolute silence that had reclaimed the second floor. It was no longer the oppressive, terrifying silence of isolation. It was the sacred, protective quiet of a guarded sanctuary. Slowly, her large, calloused hands gripping the heavy flannel of her nightgown, she pushed herself up from the floorboards. The fire in the hearth had died down to a dull, pulsing cherry red, no longer casting enough light to illuminate the corners of the room. Drawn by a sudden, inexplicable pull, Evelina walked across the thick woven rug toward the large window facing the front of the property. The glass was freezing, a delicate, sprawling lattice of silver frost creeping up the panes from the bitter prairie chill outside. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass, wiping away a small circle of condensation to peer out into the night. The Ironwood compound was bathed in the stark, ethereal light of a full silver moon. The wind whipped across the open yard, picking up swirling eddies of loose dirt and driving them against the wooden fences. It was a brutal, unforgiving landscape that demanded absolute resilience from anything trying to survive upon it. And there, standing perfectly still in the center of the sweeping driveway, was Harlan Vance. He hadn't gone to sleep. He was fully dressed in his heavy canvas duster, the collar turned up against the biting wind, his wide-brimmed Stetson pulled low over his eyes. His massive silhouette was an immovable anchor against the howling gale. Evelina watched as he slowly walked the perimeter of the compound. He checked the heavy iron latch on the main barn. He paused near the bunkhouse, listening to the muffled snores of his men, ensuring their peace. He was the undisputed king of this empire, yet he was also its most vigilant solitary watchman. Evelina's breath plumed softly against the cold window pane. A monster, the town had called him, but as she watched him stand guard in the freezing dark, she realized with a profound, shattering clarity exactly why Oakhaven despised him. The people of Oakhaven thrived on petty cruelties, on gossip, on tearing down those weaker than themselves to build up their own fragile pride. They were chaotic, loud, and vicious. Harlan Vance was the exact terrifying opposite. He was a man of absolute unyielding order. He did not speak unless his words had weight. He did not act unless his actions had purpose. He possessed a terrifying, insurmountable strength that could not be manipulated, bullied, or bought with cheap smiles. To the weak and the wicked, a man of such unbreakable principles and silent power was a monster. They feared what they could not control. But to Evelina, a woman who had spent her entire life battered by the chaotic, unpredictable cruelty of others, Harlan's unyielding nature was not terrifying. It was a fortress. His rules were clear. His protection was absolute. He had not looked at her broad shoulders and seen a beast of burden. He had seen a foundation stone, a woman with the sheer physical and emotional substance required to stand beside him in the storm. She watched him until the silver moonlight began to bleed into the slate-grey pallor of false dawn. Harlan finally turned, his heavy boots crunching softly on the frozen dirt, and disappeared under the awning of the back porch. The new day was breaking. Evelina turned away from the window. The terrifying, paralyzing exhaustion of yesterday was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant hum of purpose in her veins. She didn't return to the warm, inviting sanctuary of the massive bed. Instead, she moved to the armoire. She bypassed the faded, restrictive grey bodice she had worn the day before, leaving it crumpled in the corner where it belonged. Instead, she pulled out a sturdy, dark brown wool skirt and a practical, stark white linen blouse she had packed at the bottom of her canvas trunk. It was a garment with plenty of room in the shoulders, designed for movement, for work, for a woman who needed to take up space. She dressed quickly in the cold room, her thick, capable fingers making quick work of the buttons. She gathered her heavy, dark hair, twisting it into a secure, no-nonsense knot at the nape of her neck, pinning it tightly. She tied her thickest canvas apron around her waist. Standing before the tarnished oval mirror above the washstand, Evelina looked at her reflection. She saw the width of her hips, the formidable breadth of her shoulders, the solid, undeniable weight of her presence. She did not hunch, she did not fold herself inward. She rolled her shoulders back, drawing a deep breath of the cold, cedar-scented air, her dark eyes flashing with a quiet, fierce resolve. She walked to the heavy oak door. Her hand rested on the iron bolt Harlan had meticulously oiled for her in the dead of night. With a smooth, silent motion, she slid the bolt back. She was no longer a prisoner of her own fear. She was the mistress of Ironwood, and it was time to claim her house. Evelina pulled the heavy oak door open. The corridor outside was still draped in the slate-grey pallor of the pre-dawn hour, the air significantly colder than the sanctuary she was leaving behind. Yet, as she stepped over the threshold, she did not shrink. She did not instinctively press her broad shoulders against the dark timber paneling as she had the night before. Instead, she walked directly down the center of the cavernous hallway, her sturdy leather boots making a soft, deliberate, and entirely unashamed rhythm against the floorboards. She descended the sweeping, monumental staircase. The house was utterly silent, wrapped in that profound, breath-holding stillness that only occurs in the final moments before the sun breaks over the horizon. Without the frantic, terrifying adrenaline of her arrival, Evelina could finally see the Ironwood main house for what it truly was. It was structurally magnificent, built of thick, unyielding timber and native stone, engineered to withstand centuries of brutal prairie winters. But it was also a house entirely devoid of a soul. It was a barracks, a fortress, a place where men slept and sought shelter, but not a place where anyone truly lived. Evelina moved through the grand, shadowed dining room, her instincts pulling her inevitably toward the back of the house. For a woman who had spent her entire life in servitude, the kitchen was the only domain she intimately understood. It was the beating heart of any homestead, the engine room that kept the machinery of survival running. She pushed open the heavy swinging door and stepped inside. The Ironwood kitchen was cavernous, its high ceilings lost in the shadows. Along the far wall sat the undisputed king of the room, a colossal black cast-iron stove. It was a magnificent beast of a machine boasting 6 burners, a massive double oven and a warming closet. But as Evelina approached it, her capable eyes quickly assessed the state of the room. It was purely utilitarian and aggressively disorganized. A stack of heavy grease-coated cast-iron skillets sat haphazardly on the broad oak work table. The zinc sink was dry, the water pump handle dull and unpolished. Open sacks of flour and cornmeal were shoved carelessly into the pantry, and a faint stale odor of old coffee grounds and cold grease hung heavy in the frigid air. Harlan's men clearly knew how to throw a slab of meat into a pan to stave off starvation, but they possessed zero understanding of how to properly maintain a hearth. In Oakhaven, the sight of such a mess would have filled Evelina Vekeptehat a crushing, suffocating dread. It would have meant a barrage of insults, a broom handle shoved into her ribs, and an impossible deadline to scrub it spotless for the innkeepers paying guests. But here, standing in the frigid silence of her Ove Kepner home, the disarray did not feel like a punishment, it felt like a blank canvas. Evelina rolled her thick white linen sleeves past her elbows, exposing her strong, capable forearms. She tied her canvas apron a little tighter around her waist. She didn't have to wait for an order. She didn't have to ask for permission. She reached for the heavy iron handle of the water pump and threw her substantial weight into it. The rhythmic creak gush, creek gush shattering the morning silence as icy pristine well water flooded the Detty Nosa basin. She moved with a fluid, powerful efficiency that was beautiful to behold. She scrubbed the heavy iron skillets until the black metal gleamed dull and clean. She organized the pantry, her broad hands effortlessly hoisting 50-pound sacks of flour onto the upper shelves. Then she turned her attention to the massive black stove. She cleaned out the cold, suffocating ash from yesterday's fire. From the wood box, she selected the dry, fragrant cedar kindling, arranging the sticks with the practiced, meticulous architecture of a master builder. She struck a sulphur match, dropping it into the dry tinder. The fire caught instantly with a low, greedy whoosh. Evelina closed the heavy iron grate, adjusting the flues. Within minutes, the magnificent black beast began to roar. The iron heated rapidly, and a wave of profound, life-giving warmth radiated outward, aggressively pushing the biting prairie chill out of the kitchen. She found a large tin of premium, dark-roasted coffee beans and poured a generous measure into the hand-cranked grinder. As she turned the heavy iron handle, the sharp, rich, intoxicating aroma of freshly ground coffee exploded into the warm air. She filled the massive enamelled percolator with fresh water and set it directly over the hottest burner. Next, she moved to the broad oak table. She found a crock of sourdough starter, a bowl of fresh eggs, and a slab of smoked bacon. Her hands, thick and dusted with flour, worked the dough with a rhythmic, mesmerizing grace, kneading life and air into the heavy mixture. As the first golden rays of the morning sun finally broke through the frost-laced kitchen windows, lighting up the flower motes dancing in the air, the Ironwood kitchen was entirely transformed. It no longer smelled of cold grease and neglect. It smelled of roasting coffee, smoking hickory wood, and the yeasty, comforting promise of fresh bread. Evelina Vance stood before the roaring stove, the heat kissing her flushed cheeks. She had not fired a gun or raised her voice, but as she wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, she knew she had just claimed her territory. The monster had built an impenetrable fortress, but Evelina was going to be the fire that made it a home. The thick, marbled slabs of smoked bacon hit the gleaming cast-iron skillet with a vicious, satisfying sizzle. Plumes of rich, savoury smoke instantly billowed upward, mingling with the sharp, dark aroma of the boiling coffee. Evelina moved around the massive stove with the practiced, unconscious grace of a seasoned ship captain navigating her own deck. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess her movements. Her thick, capable hands worked in a fluid rhythm, flipping the meat, checking the rising sourdough biscuits in the oven, wiping down the butcher block. For the first time in her life, she wasn't cooking to appease a cruel master or to stave off a beating. She was cooking to nourish. She was cooking to claim her space. Outside, the Ironwood compound was beginning to stir. The distant, muffled shouts of the ranch hands carrying over from the bunkhouse and the restless nickering of the horses in the frozen corral signalled the start of the punishing workday. Then the heavy, unmistakable tread of boots sounded on the back porch. Thud, jingle, thud. Evelina's broad shoulders tensed instinctively, her grip tightening on the iron spatula. The old, deeply ingrained panic flared for a fraction of a second. What if Mott used Tumo Sehat flour? What if he didn't want me touching his provisions? In Oakhaven, initiative from a servant was often rewarded with a sharp slap for wasting expensive supplies. The heavy iron latch of the kitchen's back door lifted, the door swung open, letting in a sudden, violent gust of freezing, ozone-laced prairie wind, followed immediately by Harlan Vance. He stepped over the threshold, bringing the raw, untamed wilderness inside with him. His heavy canvas duster was dusted with a fine layer of white frost, his wide-brimmed Stetson pulled low. He looked exhausted, the sharp, patrician lines of his face drawn tight from a night spent standing guard in the freezing dark. Harlan reached back to push the door shut, fully expecting the usual greeting of the Ironwood kitchen. A wall of biting cold, the smell of stale grease, and the grim necessity of making his own bitter, sludgy coffee before facing his men. Instead, he was hit by a solid, physical wall of radiant heat. Harlan froze in his tracks, his massive hand still resting on the iron latch. The icy blue of his eyes widened slightly beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He slowly took in the scene before him. The zinc sink was gleaming, the pantry was organized. The massive black stove, usually a cold, dormant beast, was roaring with life. And standing at the center of it all, bathed in the golden morning light streaming through the frost-laced windows, was Evelina. She was not hunched over. She was not trying to make herself small. She stood tall in her sturdy brown wool skirt and crisp white blouse, her canvas apron dusted with flour, looking like the absolute, undisputed goddess of the hearth. Her dark hair, secured at the nape of her neck, framed a face flushed with heat and exertion. Evelina turned slowly, the heavy iron spatula in her hand. She met his gaze, her dark eyes wide and searching, waiting for the reprimand. She waited for him to demand why she was wasting his premium coffee beans or burning his expensive firewood so early in the morning. Harlan didn't say a word. He slowly took off his Stetson, hanging it on the wooden peg by the door. He unbuttoned his heavy, frost-covered duster, letting the canvas fall away to reveal his broad chest in a simple dark wool shirt. He walked into the kitchen, his muffled spurs ticking softly against the floorboards until he stood just a few feet away from the stove. He looked at the sizzling bacon, he looked at the perfectly arranged wood box, and then he looked at Evelina's hands, broad, capable, and currently resting steadily on her hips. The silence between them stretched, thick and simmering, but it was completely devoid of the terrifying oppression from the night before. It was a silence heavy with profound, unspoken awe. Evelina swallowed hard, deciding to break the standoff. She didn't offer a frantic apology or a submissive bow. Instead, she reached for the heavy enameled percolator with a thick cloth. She took a clean ceramic mug from the shelf and poured a steady stream of pitch-black steaming coffee. She turned and held the mug out to him. "It's dark roasted," Evelina stated, her voice surprisingly steady, a rich, resonant timbre that easily filled the cavernous room, "and it's hot." Harlan looked at the offered mug, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor crossing his strong jaw. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. As he took it, his thumb intentionally brushed against the flour-dusted skin of her knuckles. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of raw electric heat straight up Evelina's arm, making her breath hitch. Harlan brought the mug to his lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, the deep, rich flavor and the scalding heat washing away the bone-deep chill of the prairie night. It wasn't just coffee. It was a taste of something he hadn't allowed himself to want in years. It was the taste of a home. He lowered the mug, his icy blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that threatened to buckle her knees. "Mort have commanded a dozen men on this property. For 5 years," Harlan murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to wrap entirely around her, "and not one of them has ever managed to make this kitchen feel anything less than a tomb." He took another slow sip of the coffee, his gaze never leaving her face. "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," he said softly. The simple, respectful title, spoken not as a mockery but as a profound, undeniable truth, settled over Evelina like a heavy protective mantle. She turned back to the stove, a small, genuine smile touching the corners of her lips for the first time in as long as she could remember, the sizzling of the bacon suddenly sounding like a triumphant applause. Evelina turned her back to the massive iron stove, her heart beating a steady, grounded rhythm against her ribs. She reached for a thick cloth and pulled the heavy Dutch oven from the warming rack. As she lifted the cast-iron lid, a cloud of fragrant yeasty steam plumed into the air, revealing a dozen perfectly risen sourdough biscuits, their crusts baked to a flawless golden brown. She moved to the butcher block, quickly and efficiently plating the meal. She heaped thick slabs of the sizzling bacon, eggs fried perfectly in the savoury drippings, and a small mountain of the steaming biscuits onto 2 heavy ceramic plates. She didn't skimp on the portions. She knew the sheer caloric toll the freezing prairie demanded of a man Harlan-esque size, and she also knew, with a quiet, defiant pride, that her own substantial frame required nourishment to maintain its strength. She carried the plates to the long, scarred oak dining table that occupied the centre of the kitchen. Harlan had already taken a seat at the head of the table, but as Evelina approached, she noticed something that momentarily stalled the breath in her lungs. He wasn't hunched over the table like a starving wolf. He wasn't banging his fists or demanding his meal. His large, calloused hands were resting quietly on the scarred wood, and he was waiting. In the Oak Haven boarding house, the drunken patrons and exhausted merchants would snatch food directly from the serving platters before Evelina could even set them down, their manners no better than feral dogs. But the master of Ironwood sat with the quiet, imposing dignity of a king, waiting for the woman who had prepared the meal to take her place. Evelina set his plate down before him, the ceramic clinking softly against the wood. She then moved to place her own plate at the far end of the long table, fully intending to keep a respectful servant-like distance. "Sit here," Harlan commanded softly. He didn't point to the far end, he nodded to the heavy wooden chair immediately to his right. Evelina froze, her thick fingers still hovering over her plate. The old suffocating anxiety whispered in her ear, "You take up too, Mouge Hat Room. You will crowd him, he will see how heavily you eat." She looked at the chair, then at his impassive, chiseled profile. "Harlan, Mortem, accustomed to eating in the kitchen," she stammered, the words tumbling out in a raspy whisper. "Do want to crowd you?" Harlan slowly turned his head, his icy blue eyes locked onto hers, completely devoid of pity or mockery. "This is the kitchen, Evelina, and the table is 8 feet long. You couldn't crowd me if you tried. Sit down." It was a cruel order. It was a firm, undeniable validation of her right to share his space. With a trembling hand, Evelina picked up her plate and moved to the chair beside him. As she sat down, the heavy oak chair groaned slightly, but for the first time she didn't flush with shame. She looked at the table. Beside her, Harlan's massive shoulders and thick, muscular arms took up an equal amount of space. In the cramped, delicate parlours of Oakhaven, Evelina had always felt like an overgrown giantess. But sitting here beside the monumental, immovable force of Harlan Vance, she finally felt profoundly, beautifully proportionate. They ate in silence. It wasn't the terrifying, oppressive silence of the night before, but a companionable, necessary quiet of two hungry people replenishing their strength. As Evelina broke a hot biscuit, letting the golden butter melt into the steaming crumb, her mind drifted back to the dusty, malicious streets of Oakhaven. She finally understood the genesis of the monster myth. The townsfolk were petty, fragile creatures who survived on gossip and manipulation. They expected a wealthy rancher to swagger into the saloon, buy rounds of cheap whiskey, and laugh at their cruel, small-minded jokes. But Harlan Vance owed no man anything. He paid his debts in hard gold, demanded absolute fairness, and refused to engage in their chaotic, drunken theatre. To a town of weak men, unyielding strength and unbribable morality were terrifying. They called him a monster because he refused to roll in the mud with them. And Evelina, a woman who had been conditioned her entire life to believe she was a monster because of her size, had blindly believed the rumours. She had thought she was being sold to a matching beast. "You make a fine biscuit, Mrs. Vance," Harlan said suddenly, his deep voice cutting through her thoughts. Evelina blinked, pulling herself back to the sunlit kitchen. Harlan had already cleared his plate, a testament to his massive appetite, but he was holding the last half of a biscuit, examining the flaky layers verkepte hard genuine respect. "The crust is crisp, but the crumb is light," he continued, taking a bite. He didn't offer flowery, insincere poetry. He offered frontier honesty, which to Evelina was infinitely more valuable. "Most of the hands out here turned flour into lead shot, but haven't tasted bread this good since my grandmother passed." A deep, radiant heat bloomed in Evelina's chest, spreading outward to flush her cheeks. She lowered her gaze to her plate, a small, genuine smile tugging at her lips. "The secret is cold butter and not overworking the dough," she replied softly, her voice gaining a fraction of confidence, "and a very hot oven." Harlan swallowed the last bite and leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He picked up his coffee mug, studying her over the rim. "A hot oven," he mused, a faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touching his eyes. "It seems Mac made a very wise investment yesterday." He didn't mean the gold. He didn't mean the contract. As he looked at her broad, capable shoulders and the sudden, beautiful spark of pride in her dark eyes, Evelina knew exactly what he meant. He was looking at the woman who was going to bring his dead house back to life. As Harlan set his empty coffee mug down, the deep, resonant thunk of the ceramic against the oak table acted like a starting pistol in Evelina's mind. 22 years of brutal conditioning instantly overrode the brief, fragile moment of companionable peace they had just shared. She stood up so quickly that her heavy wooden chair scraped harshly against the floorboards. Her broad hands moved with a frantic, deeply ingrained, servant-like efficiency. She reached across the table, stacking his empty plate on top of hers, her fingers already reaching for the greasy cast-iron skillet resting on the tray. Her breath quickened, a sudden cold spike of anxiety piercing her chest. She had to clean. She had to scrub. She had to prove to the master of Ironwood that she was worth the gold he had spent, before he realized she was just the useless heavy girl Oakhaven had always claimed her to be. Mort le Glunk have the sink filled and the iron scrubbed before the men head out. Evelina rushed out, her voice breathless, her dark eyes fixed entirely on the greasy plates rather than her husband. Mort can start the lunch stew right after, and then Mort le Glunk sweep the foyer. Evelina. The single word wasn't shouted, but it possessed a low, vibrating authority that instantly froze the frantic movement of her hands. Harlan did not stand up. He remained seated in his chair, his massive frame perfectly still. He slowly reached out across the table. He didn't grab her wrist or snatch the plates away. He simply placed his large, calloused hand flat against the oak tabletop right next to her trembling fingers. It was a grounding gesture, a physical anchor thrown into the chaotic, terrified storm of her mind. "Leave the plates," Harlan commanded softly. Evelina's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine panic crossing her features. "But the bacon grease will set in the cold. It will take twice the lye to scrub it later. Mort have to earn." "You have to breathe," Harlan interrupted, his voice dropping to a gentle, steady timbre that completely short-circuited her panic. "Mort have a chore boy in the bunkhouse, young Toby. He washes the men's tins, and starting today he will come to the main house after breakfast to do the heavy scrubbing for you. You are not a scullery maid, Mrs. Vance." Evelina stared at him, the heavy ceramic plate slipping slightly in her grip. A chore boy? For her in Oakhaven she had been the chore boy, the scullery maid, the laundress, and the scapegoat all rolled into one exhausted, heavily bruised body. The concept of someone else doing the heavy scrubbing so she wouldn't have to was so entirely foreign it felt like a trap. She slowly lowered the plates back to the table, her broad shoulders slumping a fraction as the frantic adrenaline began to drain away. Harlan finally stood up. He was devastatingly tall, his head nearly brushing the low-hanging iron pot rack above the butcher block. He walked past her, his muffled spurs ticking softly, and stopped in front of the frost-covered window facing the vast frozen expanse of the Ironwood Prairie. The morning sun was fully up now, casting harsh, blinding light over the snow-dusted ground. "Come here," he said quietly, not looking back. Evelina hesitated, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her heavy canvas apron. She walked over to him, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough to feel the radiant furnace-like heat rolling off his broad chest. Harlan gestured to the window with a slight nod of his head. "Look out there, Evelina," he murmured, his breath plumbing faintly against the cold glass. "What do you see?" She looked. She saw miles of unyielding, brutal frontier. She saw the heavy timber fences, the massive fortified barns, and the distant dark shapes of the cattle huddled together against the biting wind. It was a landscape that offered absolutely no mercy. "Mort see your ranch," she answered honestly, her voice quiet. "Mort see a fortress." "Mort built it from dirt and blood," Harlan said, the rough, gravelly texture of his voice carrying the weight of years of bone-breaking labour. "Mort came out here with nothing but a Winchester and a good horse. Mort sank the wells myself. Mort drove the fence posts until my hands bled. And Mort fought off rustlers and winter storms to keep 1,000 head of cattle alive. Mort know how to command a crew of hardened men. Mort know how to break a wild stallion so he takes a saddle." He turned his head, his icy blue eyes locking onto hers with a sudden raw vulnerability that took her breath away. "But Mort do not know how to build a fire that actually warms a room," Harlan confessed, the admission stripping away the terrifying myth of the monster entirely. "Mort built this massive house to prove to the territory that Ironwood was permanent, but since the day the last nail was driven, it has been nothing but a tomb. It's cold, it's empty. Mort have survived out here, Evelina, but Mort have not lived." He turned fully toward her, the sheer physical substance of him blocking out the harsh light from the window. "Mort dana throw that gold at the innkeeper to buy a servant," Harlan said, his words deliberate, burning with absolute sincerity. "Mort brought you here because Mort saw the way you held yourself in that tavern. Mort saw a woman with the physical and emotional substance to withstand a storm. Mort brought you here because Mort need a partner strong enough to take this dead, empty fortress and turn it into a home. Evelina stood perfectly still, her heart swelling with an emotion so vast and powerful it felt like it might crack her ribs. The man who owned the horizon wasn't looking down on her. He was looking at Mort for her broad shoulders and her thick, capable hands, and he was asking her to be the very heartbeat of his empire. The word partner hung in the warm, coffee-scented air of the kitchen, heavier and more precious than any piece of gold Harlan Vance could have offered. Evelina stared up at him, her breath hitching. For her entire life she had been a burden. She had been the unwanted heavy girl, the clumsy maid, the space taker. No one had ever needed her for anything other than the brute labor her broad shoulders could provide. But Harlan was to asking for a laborer. He was asking for a heart. He was looking at her substantial frame and seeing the exact foundation required to support his empire. Before she could find the words to answer the profound shattering vulnerability in his icy blue eyes, a sudden desperate sound broke the quiet intimacy of the room. Scratch, whine. It came from the heavy back door. It was the knock of a ranch hand. It was a low, pathetic, vibrating whimper that ended in a sharp yelp. Harlan's demeanor shifted instantly. The vulnerable man vanished, replaced in a fraction of a second by the formidable master of Ironwood. He turned his broad back to the window and strode toward the door in 3 massive steps, pulling the iron latch open. Lying on the frost-covered planks of the back porch was one of the massive wire-haired hounds that guarded the property. The beast was huge, easily weighing over 100 pounds, a creature bred for dragging down coyotes and cornering mountain lions. But right now the fearsome animal was shivering violently, holding its thick right front paw off the ground. Dark, fresh blood dripped steadily from the pad, staining the white frost. "Damn it," Harlan cursed softly, crouching down. He must have caught a jagged piece of shale down by the creek. Harlan reached out to examine the paw. The hound, despite its loyalty, was half feral and in immense pain. It let out a vicious, guttural growl, its lips curling back to expose long, yellowed canines, snapping its heavy jaws inches from Harlan's leather glove. "He want to let me bind it," Harlan said, his jaw tightening in frustration. He started to stand, but Luglunk have to get Silas to help me pin him down in the dirt, or he Luglunk bleed out. No. The word was quiet, but it possessed a resonant, immovable authority that made Harlan pause. Evelina didn't hesitate. She didn't cower from the snarling, bloodied beast, nor did she ask for permission. She moved to the zinc sink, grabbing a clean tin basin and filling it with the hot, lye-free water from the stove reservoir. She snatched a stack of clean white rags from the pantry shelf and walked directly to the open back door. "Evelina, step back," Harlan warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. He threw his arm out, trying to block her path. He swiled, "He Luglunk, tear your hand open." "He is terrified, Harlan," Evelina corrected gently, her dark eyes entirely devoid of fear. She looked at her husband, and Mott, I'm not fragile. She stepped around Harlan's blocking arm and knelt directly onto the cold, hard floorboards of the threshold. Her sturdy brown wool skirt pooled around her like a heavy grounding blanket. To a creature in pain, sudden movements and nervous, fluttering energy were terrifying. But Evelina possessed none of those things. Her sheer size and the deliberate, unhurried weight of her movements radiated a profound, calming stability. She set the basin of steaming water down. The massive hound growled again, a terrifying rumble deep in its chest, its hackles raised. Evelina didn't flinch. She didn't try to sweet-talk the dog with high-pitched noises. She simply leaned forward, allowing her substantial presence to act as a solid, comforting wall. She placed her left hand firmly but gently on the hound's thick, trembling shoulder. Her hand was broad, her fingers thick and calloused, hands that Oakhaven had mocked as clumsy and unladylike. But here, pinning the trembling muscle of a 100-pound predator, they were the exact right tool for the job. The dog snapped again, its teeth grazing her canvas apron. Evelina didn't jerk away. She applied a steady, grounding pressure to its shoulder, her touch projecting absolute safety. "Hush now," she murmured, her voice a deep, vibrating alto. "Mort, have you? You are safe." Miraculously, the frantic, wild terror in the hound's eyes began to dim. The vicious growl stuttered and died, replaced by a ragged, exhausted sigh. The massive beast slowly lowered its heavy head, resting its chin directly onto the thick folds of Evelina's skirt, submitting entirely to her strength. With her right hand, Evelina took a warm, wet rag and gently began to clean the laceration. Her movements were incredibly precise. She washed away the blood and grit, revealing a deep, clean slice across the thick leather of the pad. She applied a smear of drawing salve she had noticed in the pantry earlier, and with steady, practiced hands, she wrapped the paw in a tight, secure bandage, tying the linen off neatly. Harlan Vance stood in the doorway, perfectly still, watching the scene unfold. He watched the woman the town had called a useless lump easily subdue a half-feral predator, using nothing but the sheer, magnificent gravity of her presence and the profound gentleness of her touch. He saw the stark contrast of her broad, powerful shoulders bowed over the injured animal, her thick hands moving with the delicacy of a master surgeon. Evelina gave the dog one final, firm pat on its uninjured shoulder and stood up, lifting the bloody basin. She turned to find Harlan staring at her, the icy blue of his eyes completely melted into an expression of absolute, unadulterated reverence. She hadn't just bandaged a hound, she had just proven without a single shadow of a doubt that she was exactly the heartbeat Ironwood had been waiting for. Evelina moved back into the kitchen, carrying the tin basin to the Diina Guerre sink to rinse away the blood. The massive hound, now sporting a neat white bandage, did not retreat to the cold yard. Instead, it limped over the threshold, circled twice on the woven rug near the roaring stove, and collapsed with a heavy, contented sigh, its nose resting near the hem of Evelina's sturdy skirt. Harlan remained by the back door, his hand still resting on the iron latch. He watched his wife, the woman he had essentially purchased from a life of dirt and humiliation, move through his kitchen with the undeniable authority of a queen in her castle. "Mort le Glunk, have Toby bring up an old saddle blanket for him," Harlan finally said, his voice unusually soft, the gravelly edge entirely smoothed out by the awe still lingering in his chest. "He should be out in the frost until that pad knits." "He can stay near the stove," Evelina replied, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't ask if the dog was allowed inside, she stated it as a matter of fact. It was her kitchen now. Harlan gave a slow, deep nod of agreement. He pushed the heavy back door shut, sealing out the biting prairie wind. He reached for his canvas duster and Stetson, the brief morning respite over. The punishing demands of the 1,000-acre ranch were waiting for him. As he buttoned the heavy coat, he stopped and looked at Evelina. "Mort will be riding the South Ridge today to check the fence lines," Harlan informed her, his tone shifting from the vulnerability of their earlier conversation to the practical, commanding cadence of a ranch boss. "I want to be back until sunset. Silas, my foreman, will be in the yard if you need anything, and Toby will be up shortly to handle the heavy scrubbing and carry your firewood." He took a step toward her, closing the physical distance until he was standing just a breath away. Evelina looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his. The sheer size of him, enveloped in the heavy canvas, was imposing, but the fear that had paralyzed her the night before was entirely gone. Harlan reached into the pocket of his duster. He pulled out a heavy iron key ring. It held dozens of keys. Keys to the smokehouse, the root cellar, the grain silos, and the heavy padlocks on the main barns. It was the physical manifestation of Ironwood wealth and survival. He didn't hand her a single key to the pantry. He held out the entire ring. "This is yours," Harlan stated. Evelina stared at the heavy iron ring resting in his calloused palm. The implications were staggering. In Oakhaven, the innkeeper wore the keys tied tightly to her waist, a constant jingling reminder of her absolute control. Evelina had never been trusted with more than a broom. To be handed the keys to an entire empire on her first morning was a leap of faith so massive it made her slightly dizzy. "Harlan, Mort," she hesitated, her hand hovering over his. "These are the provisions for the whole winter. Mort don't know your ledgers. Mort don't can know ove kep." "You will learn," Harlan interrupted gently, cutting off her doubt. He reached out with his other hand, taking her thick, broad fingers and wrapping them securely around the cold iron keys. "Mort, trust your judgment, Evelina. Feed the men well, but protect the stores. The house is yours to command." He squeezed her hand, a firm grounding pressure that sent a spike of profound reassurance straight to her core before letting go. He touched the brim of his hat, turned and walked out the back door, his silver spurs jingling Vekep Tehat purpose. Evelina stood in the warm kitchen, the heavy iron keys heavy and cold in her hand. She looked down at them, the physical weight of her new reality finally settling over her shoulders. She was not a prisoner, she was not a scullery maid, she was the mistress of Ironwood. A sudden sharp knock on the back door startled her. She opened it to find a lanky, nervous-looking boy of about 14. He wore an oversized wool coat and was holding a heavy bucket of lye soap and a stiff scrubbing brush. His eyes darted nervously to the massive bandaged hound resting by the stove, then up to Evelina's broad, imposing figure. "Morning, ma'am," the boy squeaked, hastily pulling off his cap. "Mort met, Toby. Mr. Vance sent me up. Said Mort met to answer to you now, for the scrubbing and the hauling." Evelina looked at the boy. She saw the same nervous, exhausted tension in his shoulders that she had carried for 22 years. She remembered they kept hatate it felt like to be ordered around by cruel, demanding masters. She did bark an order. She stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in, Toby," Evelina said, her voice dropping into a warm, resonant, and deeply maternal timbre. "Leave the bucket by the sink, but before you scrub anything, there are hot biscuits and fresh bacon grease in the pan. Sit at the table and eat your fill." Toby's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. "Eat in the main house, ma'am, but the boss—" "The boss has left me the keys." Evelina smiled, a genuine, powerful expression that completely transformed her face. She held up the heavy iron ring, "And Mort say a boy can scrub cast iron on an empty stomach. Sit." As Toby scrambled gratefully toward the oak table, Evelina tied the heavy ring of keys to the sturdy waistband of her brown wool skirt. They jingled softly against her hip as she moved, a solid, undeniably powerful sound. It wasn't the sound of captivity, it was the sound of a queen taking her throne. With Toby diligently attacking the heavy cast-iron skillets at the sink, his stomach full of hot biscuits and his terrified demeanour completely melted away, Evelina left the warmth of the kitchen to face the rest of the Ironwood main house. The heavy iron key ring jingled against her sturdy wool skirt, a steady, empowering rhythm that accompanied her back into the grand, shadowed foyer. The morning sunlight was Novekep aggressively piercing the tall, dust-caked windows, flanking the door, revealing the sheer magnitude of the neglect in the formal living spaces. In Oakhaven, the innkeeper had demanded the parlour be kept immaculate for the paying guests, a shallow facade of gentility while the back rooms rotted. Harlan, it seemed, cared nothing for facades. He had built a fortress to survive, and without a partner to breathe life into it, he had simply let the non-essential rooms sleep. Evelina walked past the sweeping staircase, her eyes catching on a set of heavy, double oak doors at the end of the hall. They were closed, looking far more imposing than the doors to the parlour or the dining room. She stepped up to them. The brass handles were tarnished, cold to the touch. She tried the latch, but it was locked tight. Evelina unclipped the heavy iron ring from her waistband. She sifted through the jagged brass and iron keys, her thick fingers selecting a medium-sized, intricately cut brass key. She slid it into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clunk. She pushed the doors open and stepped over the threshold, entirely unprepared for what she was about to find. She had expected an armory. She had expected a dark, violent room filled with rifles, hunting trophies, and the harsh accoutrements of a man the territory called a monster. Instead, the air that rushed out to greet her smelled of rich, oiled leather, aged paper, and the sharp, clean scent of fine pipe tobacco. Evelina gasped softly, her dark eyes widening as she took in the room. It was a massive study, lined from the floorboards to the vaulted ceiling with towering dark walnut bookshelves, and they were not empty. They were packed with hundreds, perhaps thousands, of books. Thick, leather-bound volumes, cloth-covered treatises, and heavily thumbed novels filled every available inch of shelf space. In the centre of the room sat a colossal mahogany desk piled high with neat stacks of ledgers, land deeds, and maps, but it was the books that drew Evelina like a magnet. In Oakhaven, knowledge was a luxury strictly forbidden to the heavy, clumsy maid. Evelina had taught herself to read using discarded, grease-stained newspapers left behind by travelling merchants. She possessed a sharp, voracious mind, a terrible hunger for the world beyond the dusty town square, but she had been forced to starve it. Her intellect, much like her broad shoulders, had been deemed an unnatural, unwanted trait. She walked slowly toward the nearest shelf, her sturdy boots silent on the thick Persian row-you-go that covered the floor. She reached out, her thick, capable fingers trembling slightly as she traced the gold leaf spine of a heavy volume. Homer, Shakespeare, Emerson, treatises on modern agriculture and soil engineering, histories of the Roman Empire. These were not the books of a brute, they were the library of a profoundly deep, fiercely intelligent mind. They were the silent companions of a man who possessed a soul far too vast for the petty, shallow gossip of a frontier town. Evelina pulled a worn copy of Whitman's poetry from the shelf. As it opened in her large hands, a small, dried bluebonnet fell from between the pages, fluttering gently to the floor. It was a delicate, heartbreakingly tender marker of a favourite passage. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. The profound, tragic irony of it all struck her like a physical blow. The town of Oakhaven had looked at Harlan's unyielding strength and called him a monster, completely blind to the brilliant poetic intellect hidden behind his stoic walls. Just as they had looked at Evelina's substantial, heavy frame and called her a useless lump, completely blind to the capable, intelligent woman trapped inside. They were the same. They were two massive, profound souls who had been entirely misunderstood by a world too small to hold them. Harlan hadn't just bought a manager to cook his meals. He had found his mirror. Evelina walked over to the massive mahogany desk. She didn't shrink away from it. She pulled out the heavy leather chair, a chair built for a giant, and sat down. The leather groaned, but the chair held her securely, its wide armrests perfectly accommodating her broad hips. She rested her thick hands flat on the polished wood of the desk, taking in the view of the sprawling prairie from the window behind it. She felt the immense, terrifying weight of the Ironwood Empire resting in this room, but as she sat in Harlan's chair, surrounded by his books and his mind, the weight didn't crush her, it anchored her. She picked up a dust rag she had tucked into her apron. She was going to scrub this room like a servant. She was going to care for it like a wife. With slow, reverent movements, Evelina began to wipe the dust from the leather bindings, carefully preserving the quiet, brilliant sanctuary of the man she was beginning to understand, and dangerously close to loving. By the time the late afternoon sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, painting the prairie in bruised shades of violet and indigo, the Ironwood main house was entirely unrecognizable from the frozen tomb Evelina had entered the night before. She had not frantically scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees in a panic of servitude. She had directed Toby to do the heavy scouring, while she applied her meticulous, caring touch to the heart of the home. The suffocating scent of stale dust and cold ash was completely banished. The cavernous foyer now smelled cleanly of lemon oil and beeswax, the dark walnut banisters gleaming under the warm, ambient light of the freshly trimmed oil lamps. In the kitchen, the massive black stove was humming a low, steady tune. Resting on the hottest burner was a colossal cast-iron Dutch oven. Inside, a rich, dark stew of thick-cut beef, winter-root vegetables and dark ale had been simmering for hours. The savoury, intoxicating aroma permeated the thick timber walls, seeping out onto the back porch as a siren song against the biting evening chill. Evelina untied her flour-dusted apron, replacing it with a clean one from her trunk. Her back ached with a dull, satisfying burn, and her thick legs were tired, but it was the clean, honest exhaustion of a woman building her own sanctuary. She decided the formal parlour, a massive room adjacent to the foyer, needed a fire. The ambient heat from the kitchen wouldn't be enough to combat the plummeting nighttime temperatures. She walked out to the covered back porch where the split firewood was stacked. Most of the pieces were manageable, but at the bottom of the pile sat a massive unsplit knot of dense blackjack oak. It was a beast of a log, heavy enough to warp a wagon axle, left behind by the hands who deemed it too stubborn to burn. Evelina didn't call for Toby. In Oakhaven, she had routinely hauled water barrels that weighed twice as much. She bent her knees, engaged her sturdy core, and hoisted the massive oak knot into her arms. The rough bark bit into her forearms through her linen sleeves, but her broad shoulders bore the tremendous weight with an impressive, silent strength. She turned and pushed through the back door, carrying the colossal log through the kitchen and down the hallway toward the parlour. Just as she reached the threshold of the formal room, the heavy front door of the house swung open. A violent gust of freezing wind rushed in, instantly followed by Harlan. He was covered in a fine layer of prairie dust and frost, his breath plumbing in the cool air of the foyer. He paused, his icy blue eyes immediately registering the polished wood, the warm glow of the lamps, and the mouth-watering scent of the stew. He looked like a weary soldier stepping unexpectedly through the gates of heaven. Then his gaze locked onto Evelina. She was standing in the doorway of the parlor, her face flushed, her thick arms wrapped securely around a piece of oak that would have broken the back of a lesser man. Harlan's jaw tightened. He did unbutton his duster. He crossed the foyer in 3 massive, purposeful strides, the silver spurs on his boots ringing sharply against the floorboards. He stopped directly in front of her. Before Evelina could utter a word of greeting, Harlan reached out. He didn't ask. He simply slid his massive, leather-gloved hands under the rough bark of the log and took the immense weight from her arms effortlessly. Mort told Toby to handle the hauling, Harlan said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the tight space between them. Evelina dropped her arms, a sudden familiar flush of defensiveness rising to her cheeks. She squared her broad shoulders, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. Toby was busy fetching water for the horses. It's just 1 log, Harlan. Mort, am perfectly capable of carrying it. Mort, know you are capable, Evelina, Harlan replied smoothly. He didn't look at her verkep, heart pity, and he certainly didn't look at her with the condescending amusement men often reserved for women. He looked at Mort for her with a fierce, unwavering intensity. He stepped past her, walking into the parlor, and dropped the massive oak knot onto the stone hearth with a deafening floor-shaking thud. He turned slowly, facing her in the doorway. Mort have never doubted your strength, Harlan continued, stripping off his heavy leather gloves and tossing them onto a nearby chair. Mort saw you pin a 100-pound feral hound to the floorboards this morning. Mort can know verkep exactly how usehat physical substance you possess. But that does to mean Mort want you breaking your back doing the labour Mort my hands to do. Evelina swallowed hard, her dark eyes wide. In Oakhaven, if Mort didn't carry the heavy loads Mort dana to eat. Harlan closed the distance between them again. The smell of the freezing prairie clung to him, a sharp contrast to the warm scent of baking bread radiating from her skin. You are not in Oakhaven, Harlan stated, his voice dropping an octave, becoming incredibly thick and intimate. You are the mistress of Ironwood. You are my wife, and while Mort expect you to command this house with absolute authority, Mort will not allow you to be treated like a draft horse, not by the men, and certainly not by yourself. The absolute, unyielding respect in his words struck Evelina with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't telling her she was weak. He wasn't trying to make her small. He was simply profoundly demanding that she elevate her own worth to match the crown he had placed upon her head. Now, Harlan murmured, a sudden devastatingly handsome softness relaxing the harsh lines of his exhausted face. Tell me that smell coming from the kitchen is real and not a frost-induced hallucination. The Ironwood kitchen, bathed in the rich golden light of 3 oil lamps, felt like the absolute center of the universe. The howling prairie wind battered the thick exterior walls, but inside, the massive cast-iron stove radiated an impenetrable life-giving heat. They sat opposite each other at the long oak table. Between them rested the colossal Dutch oven. Now half empty, Harlan ate with the focused, quiet intensity of a man who had spent 10 hours in the freezing saddle. But his manners remained impeccably deliberate. He didn't rush, savouring the incredibly rich dark ale broth and the tender, slow-braised beef as if it were a royal feast. Evelina watched him over the rim of her ceramic tea mug. Her own plate was clean, her substantial appetite fully satisfied without a single ounce of shame. As the silence stretched, comfortable, warm, and heavy with the scent of fresh bread and wood smoke, the profound dissonance between the man sitting before her and the terrifying myth of Oakhaven finally reached a boiling point in Evelina's mind. She thought of his meticulous, silent repair of her door hinges in the dead of night. She thought of his gentle, calloused hand wrapping around hers to give her the keys to his empire. And she thought of the dried bluebonnet pressed delicately between the pages of a poetry book in a locked, silent study. She set her mug down on the scarred oak. The soft clink drew Harlan attention. He paused, his spoon resting against his plate, his icy blue eyes lifting to meet hers. Harlan, Evelina began. Her voice held a slight tremor, not from fear, but from the immense, terrifying weight of the question she was about to ask. She squared her broad shoulders, refusing to look away. Before I signed that contract, the innkeeper and the patrons of the tavern told me terrifying things about you. Harlan did not flinch. He did not slam his fist on the table. or demand to know what insults had been thrown at his name. He simply reached for his linen napkin, wiping his mouth slowly, his expression settling into a solemn, unreadable mask. Oakhaven is a town that breeds rumors the way a swamp breeds mosquitoes, Evelina, Harlan replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. What exactly did they tell you? Evelina swallowed hard, her fingers knotting into the heavy canvas of her apron under the table. They said you were the monster of Ironwood. They said you had a heart of flint. They told me you broke men for sport, and that you were buying me because you needed a beast of burden that no one else would miss. The words felt ugly and toxic in the warm kitchen, a stain on the sanctuary they had just begun to build. Harlan looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. The flickering lamplight caught the sharp, patrician angles of his jaw and the deep, exhausted lines around his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was entirely devoid of anger. It was thick with a profound, weary resignation. And after 24 hours in my house, Harlan asked quietly, "Do you believe them?" "No," Evelina answered instantly, the absolute certainty in her voice surprising even herself. A monster does not spend his night freezing in a hallway to oil the hinges of a locked door so his wife can sleep in peace, and a monster certainly does not press bluebonnets into books of poetry. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed Harlan's features, quickly melting into a look of profound, devastatingly vulnerable exposure. She had been in his study. She had seen the mind he kept hidden behind the fortress walls. He leaned back in his heavy oak chair, the wood groaning in protest. He looked out the dark window, staring into the black void of the prairie night. When Mort first came to this territory, Harlan began, his voice dropping into a rough, gravelly timber. Oakhaven was nothing but a collection of tents and corrupt men trying to swindle each other out of claims. Mort bought this land with honest money. But out here, honest money isn't enough to keep what's yours. The town wanted my water rights. They wanted to run their diseased cattle through my valley. They tried to bribe me, and when that failed, they tried to intimidate me. He turned his head slowly, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unyielding intensity. Mort did not bend, Evelina. Mort met them at the property line with a Winchester and a dozen men who answered only to me. Mort drove them back into the mud they crawled out of. Mort refused to drink at their tables. Mort refused to laugh at their cruel petty jokes, and Mort refused to play their corrupt games. Harlan leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table, closing the physical distance between them. "To a coward, unyielding strength is a terrifying thing," he murmured, his words vibrating with an absolute, undeniable truth. "A man who cannot be bought or bullied is a threat to their fragile pride, so they called me a monster, and Mott let them. Because a monster is feared and fear keeps the gates of Ironwood safe. Mott wore their insults like armor, so Mott wouldn't have to waste my life fighting off fools." Evelina's breath hitched. The profound, tragic parallel between them was so stark, so beautifully devastating, it brought hot tears to the corners of her eyes. "They called you a monster because you were too strong to be controlled," Evelina whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked down at her own broad hands, the hands Oakhaven had mocked for being too large, too heavy, too unladylike. "And they called me useless because Mott was too large to fit into their tiny, cruel boxes." Harlan reached across the table. He didn't just touch her hand, he enveloped her thick, capable fingers completely within his massive, warm grasp. It was an anchor. It was a vow. "They were entirely blind," Harlan said, his voice dropping to a fierce, possessive whisper. "They looked at a king and saw a monster, and they looked at a queen and saw a maid." He squeezed her hand, a deep, grounding pressure that shattered the last remaining walls of Evelina's insecurities. "The world outside this house can believe whatever lies they want to tell themselves," Harlan vowed, his eyes burning with an intense, protective fire. "But within these walls, Evelina, there are no monsters. There is only the master of Ironwood, and the woman who is finally turning his fortress into a home." The morning after the profound, shattering conversation in the kitchen, Evelina woke before the sun. She lay in the massive four-poster bed, watching the faint slate-grey light of false dawn begin to outline the frosted window panes. For the first time in 22 years, she did not wake with a heavy, suffocating knot of dread sitting squarely in her chest. She did not brace herself for insults. She did not mentally catalogue her physical flaws, wishing desperately she could carve away her broad shoulders or shrink her substantial hips. Harlan's words, "they looked at a queen and saw a maid," echoed in her mind, not as a fleeting compliment, but as an indestructible foundation stone upon which she was finally allowed to build herself. She rose from the warmth of the heavy crimson quilts. She dressed with a deliberate, unhurried purpose, donning her sturdy brown wool skirt and a clean, crisp white linen blouse. As she stood before the mirror to pin her thick dark hair at the nape of her neck, she met her own gaze. The terrified hunching girl from the Oakhaven boarding house was entirely gone. In her place stood a woman of undeniable substance, a woman whose sheer physical presence was no longer a burden, but her greatest asset. She reached for the heavy iron key ring resting on the oak washstand. With a firm, decisive motion, she tied it securely to the waistband of her skirt. As she walked down the grand, sweeping staircase, the keys jingled against her hip. Clink, clack. It was a heavy metallic rhythm that announced her presence to the silent house. It wasn't the rattling chains of a prisoner. It was the authoritative stride of a matriarch taking her rightful place. Evelina moved through the kitchen, stoked the massive black stove, and put a colossal pot of coffee on to boil, but this morning she didn't stay safely hidden behind the thick timber walls. She opened the heavy back door and stepped out onto the frost-covered porch. The air was bitterly cold, carrying the sharp, clean scent of ozone and frozen dirt. Across the sweeping yard near the sprawling wooden bunkhouse, the Ironwood Ranch hands were beginning to stir. They were a dozen hardened, weathered men, wrapped in faded canvas and heavy wool, grumbling as they faced the punishing reality of another brutal workday. They were huddled around a pitiful, smoking fire, drinking the bitter, muddy sludge they had boiled over the coals. As Evelina stepped off the porch, the massive wire-haired hound that had been sleeping by the kitchen stove pushed past her legs. He was heavily bandaged, but he pressed his massive head firmly against her sturdy wool skirt, trailing beside her like a loyal, fearsome shadow. Her boots crunched heavily on the frozen ground. The soft rhythmic jingling of the iron keys at her waist cut through the low murmurs of the men. One by one, the ranch hands fell silent. They turned their eyes wide beneath the brims of their battered hats, watching the new mistress of Ironwood approach. They had heard the vicious rumours from town. They expected a terrified, useless lump of a girl who would hide in the main house and weep. Instead, they saw a woman built like a fortress. She walked vacapte hat, her broad shoulders pulled back, her dark eyes scanning the compound with an eagle-sharp assessment. And by her side walked the wildest, most vicious hound on the property, entirely subdued by her presence. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a deeply scarred face and greying hair separated himself from the group. This was Silas, Harlan's foreman, a man who answered only to the master of Ironwood and trusted absolutely no one else. He took off his hat, his sharp, evaluating eyes taking in Evelina's imposing stature. "Morning, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a cautious, gravelly drawl. "Good morning, Silas," Evelina replied. Her voice was not high-pitched or nervous. It was a rich, resonant alto that carried effortlessly across the frosty yard, commanding instant attention. She didn't stop to make polite, delicate conversation. She walked directly past the bunkhouse toward the massive, heavily fortified timber smokehouse that held the winter provisions. The men watched in stunned silence as she lifted the heavy iron key ring from her waist, selected a thick brass key and slid it into the massive padlock. With a heavy, satisfying clunk, the lock gave way. Evelina pulled the heavy timber doors wide open. The rich, intoxicating aroma of hickory smoke, cured salt pork, and dried apples spilled out into the freezing morning air, making the men involuntarily inhale. She turned to face the dozen hardened cowboys. She didn't shrink under their collective stare. She stood in the doorway of the treasury, her hands resting capably on her broad hips. "Toby," Evelina called out, her voice cutting through the frosty air. The lanky chore-boy immediately darted forward from the crowd, eager to serve the woman who had fed him so well the day before. "Bring the wheelbarrow," Evelina commanded. She turned to Silas, meeting the foreman's wary gaze with absolute unyielding authority. "Mr. Vance expects you men to break the ice in the troughs and mend the south fence line today," Evelina stated, her tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You cannot do that on a stomach full of bitter water and stale hardtack." She began hoisting massive 10-pound slabs of premium smoked bacon from the hooks, dropping them into the wheelbarrow with a heavy thud. Next came 2 50-pound sacks of fine milled flour, which she lifted verkepte hat, a breathtaking, effortless display of her physical strength, followed by heavy tins of dark roasted coffee beans and a massive crock of pure cane sugar. The men stared, utterly dumbfounded. This was a king's ransom of provisions, freely handed over by a woman they had been told was a useless burden. Evelina wiped her hands on her canvas apron and looked at the stunned crew. Ironwood is the greatest ranch in this territory, and its men will eat like it, she declared, her dark eyes flashing with fierce protective pride. Toby will bring you fresh sourdough starter from my kitchen. You will eat well, you will work hard, and you will bring those cast iron skillets back to my back porch entirely scrubbed, or the premium coffee stops. Do we understand each other? Silas, the hardened, cynical foreman, stared at the mountain of high-quality food, then looked up at the formidable, broad-shouldered woman standing before him. A slow, deeply respectful grin spread across his scarred face. He placed his hat firmly back on his head and gave her a deep, unmistakable nod of absolute submission. "Yes, ma'am," Silas said, and this time the title carried the profound, heavy weight of genuine loyalty. "We understand you perfectly." As the ranch hands dispersed with a renewed, almost reverent energy, Evelina walked back toward the main house. The biting prairie wind whipped at her brown wool skirt, but she didn't shiver. The profound, radiant heat of absolute validation warmed her from the inside out. Beside her, the massive, bandaged hound limped faithfully, having officially declared his allegiance to the woman who commanded both the hearth and the heavy iron keys. She re-entered the quiet sanctuary of the house. The morning chores were handled, the stew was simmering, and the men were fed. For the first time, Evelina felt a calm, steady rhythm settling over her new life. Drawn by a quiet curiosity and a deep desire to understand the full scope of her husband's empire, she made her way back down the hall to the locked study. The heavy oak doors yielded smoothly. The room was bathed in the crisp, golden light of the morning sun, illuminating the towering walnut bookshelves and the dust motes dancing in the air. Evelina bypassed the poetry and histories she had admired the day before, moving directly to the colossal mahogany desk in the center of the room. If she was going to be the true mistress of Ironwood, she needed to understand its lifeblood. She needed to know the stores, the yields, and the demands of the upcoming winter. She sat in the heavy leather chair, the wood groaning softly under her substantial weight, and pulled the largest, thickest ledger toward her. It was bound in dark green leather, the corners reinforced with hammered brass. Evelina opened the heavy cover. The scent of aged parchment and sharp iron gall ink wafted up. She traced her thick fingers over the pages, entirely mesmerized. The ledgers of the Oakhaven boarding house had been a chaotic, frantic scrawl of debts and watered-down inventory. But Harlan's ledger was a masterpiece of order. The handwriting was not the crude, blocky print of a brute. It was an elegant, sweeping, meticulously controlled script. Columns of cattle head counts, timber yields, and supply costs were perfectly aligned, balanced to the very last copper penny. It was the written manifestation of a man who held absolute, unyielding control over his chaotic world. As she turned to the inside front cover to examine the yearly index, a thick, folded piece of heavy parchment slipped from between the pages and fluttered onto the polished mahogany. It wasn't a receipt or a supply order. It was a drafted copy of a letter written in Harlan's unmistakable, elegant hand. The date at the top was exactly 1 month prior. Evelina's eyes drifted to the salutation. To Mrs. Gable, proprietor of the Oakhaven Inn. Evelina's breath hitched, a sudden cold spike of apprehension piercing her chest. Mrs. Gable was the cruel, sharp-tongued innkeeper who had made her life a living hell. She braced herself, half expecting to read a cold, calculated transaction, a demand for the cheapest, most desperate labour available to scrub the floors of his tomb. Slowly she forced her dark eyes to read the heavy script. "Mort, am sending my foreman to your establishment with a sum of gold to secure a wife and a mistress for the Ironwood Ranch. You will inevitably attempt to send me one of the delicate, simpering parlour ornaments that flutter around your town square. Do not waste my time. The Prairie is a brutal, unforgiving crucible. It shatters glass and snaps fragile things in half. Mort do not want a woman who must be shielded from the wind. Mort do not want a woman who takes up no space. Mort require a woman of profound, unyielding substance. Mort need a foundation stone. Send me a woman hat, broad shoulders capable of bearing the weight of an empire. Send me a woman who knows the reality of hard labor and possesses the sheer physical and emotional resilience to stand beside me in the storm. If you have a woman in your town that the weak men of Oakhaven deem too heavy, too large, or too formidable to handle, she is exactly the one Mort want. Mort will pay whatever price is required to bring her home. Signed, Harlan Vance. Evelina sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair, the silence of the study ringing in her ears. The heavy parchment trembled violently in her thick, capable hands. A single hot tear escaped her eye, landing with a soft tap on the polished mahogany desk, followed rapidly by another. The final suffocating shadow of Oakhaven, the deep ingrained belief that she was a burden, a last resort, an unwanted heavy girl sold to a monster out of pure desperation, shattered into a million irrecoverable pieces. He hadn't settled for her. He hadn't bought her because she was cheap or because she was the only one left. He had specifically, fiercely, and unapologetically demanded her. He had looked at the cruel, narrow standards of the world, rejected them entirely, and written a mandate for a queen who matched his own monumental scale. The very traits that Oakhaven had mocked and despised, her broad shoulders, her substantial frame, her undeniable, formidable presence, were the exact, precise specifications Harlan Vance had required to complete his empire. Evelina carefully folded the heavy parchment, pressing it flat with her palm. She didn't put it back in the ledger. She slipped it into the pocket of her canvas apron, keeping it close to her heart. She wiped her face, took a deep, shuddering breath, and stood up from the desk. She was no longer just the mistress of Ironwood by contract. She was the mistress of Ironwood by divine, undeniable right. By late afternoon, the brutal, biting wind of the prairie had finally begun to settle, leaving behind a profound, crystalline stillness. The sky was transforming into a breathtaking canvas of bruised violet, fiery orange, and deep, aching indigo. Evelina stood on the back porch, a thick woolen shawl wrapped securely around her broad shoulders. The heavy iron key ring rested against her hip, a comforting, grounding weight. She watched as Harlan rode into the compound on his massive black gelding. He looked exhausted, his canvas duster coated in a fresh layer of prairie dust, but as he dismounted, his movements retained that predatory, unyielding grace. Before he could lead the horse to the stables, Silas, the grey-haired foreman, intercepted him in the yard. Evelina couldn't hear their words over the distance, but she watched the interaction closely. Silas spoke, gesturing toward the smokehouse, then toward the men who were currently finishing their chores with a vigor they had possessed in months. Harlan listened, his face an unreadable mask beneath the shadow of his Stetson. Then he looked up, his icy blue eyes finding Evelina on the porch. He did look angry, he looked fiercely, undeniably proud. Harlan handed the reins to Silas and strode across the frozen dirt toward the main house. His silver spurs jingled, but the sound no longer triggered the frantic, fluttering panic in Evelina's chest. It was simply the sound of her husband coming home. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. The golden hour light hit his face, softening the harsh, exhausted lines. "Silas tells me my men ate premium bacon and fresh sourdough today," Harlan said, his deep, gravelly voice carrying clearly in the still air. Evelina did not lower her gaze. She stood tall, her presence monumental and calm. "You cannot expect men to mend a heavy timber fence on a stomach full of muddy water and hardtack, Harlan. A starving army cannot hold a fortress." A slow, devastatingly handsome smile spread across Harlan's face, entirely transforming him from the stoic master of Ironwood into a man who had finally found his equal. "No," Harlan agreed softly, "they cannot." He stepped up onto the porch, but he didn't reach for the door handle. Instead, he held out his large, leather-gloved hand toward her. "Leave the stew on the simmer, Mrs. Vance," he commanded gently. "Walk verkepte at me. There is something Mott want you to see before the sun is gone entirely." Evelina placed her thick, capable hand into his. His grip was firm, encasing her fingers in a warm, protective anchor. They stepped off the porch together, walking away from the compound and heading toward the high western ridge that overlooked the valley. They walked side by side. Evelina didn't intentionally fall a step behind, nor did she fold her shoulders inward to make herself appear smaller next to his massive frame. She matched his long, deliberate strides. With every step, the folded parchment letter resting in her apron pocket seemed to radiate a profound, empowering heat against her hip. They reached the crest of the ridge just as the bottom edge of the sun touched the jagged horizon. The view was staggering. Below them stretched the Ironwood Empire, thousands of acres of raw, untamed prairie, rolling hills dotted with dense patches of blackjack oak, and the dark, winding ribbon of the creek cutting through the valley. It was vast, brutal, and breathtakingly beautiful. When Mort first bought this valley, Harlan murmured, his voice a low vibration blending with the evening breeze, the men in Oakhaven laughed. They said it was too wild. They said it would break me within a year. They judge everything by their own narrow, fragile limitations. He turned to face her, the dying sunlight catching the fierce, unyielding intellect in his eyes. They look at the horizon and see a void to fear, Harlan continued. But a void is just space waiting to be filled by something strong enough to hold it. He looked at Evelina, at her strong, broad shoulders, her sturdy stance against the wind, and the undeniable, magnificent substance of her presence. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair from her cheek. "Mort did not bring you here to hide you in that house, Evelina," Harlan vowed, his words carrying the absolute weight of a finalized treaty. "Mort brought you here because this land is too vast for a delicate woman. It requires a queen. It requires someone who knows that true strength isn't about fitting into a small space, it's about commanding the open horizon." Evelina looked out over the sprawling, golden-lit valley. The sheer scale of the world before her was immense, but for the first time in her life she didn't feel too big. She felt perfectly, beautifully scaled to the empire that was now hers to rule. The walk back down the ridge to the main compound was done in a profound, comfortable silence. Above them, the prairie sky had surrendered entirely to the night, exploding into a staggering canopy of glittering ice-white stars. The sheer vastness of the heavens mirrored the sudden, terrifyingly beautiful expansion of Evelina's own world. As they approached the main house, Evelina stopped at the base of the porch steps. The Ironwood main house no longer looked like a looming, shadowy fortress. Warm, golden light spilled from the spotless windows of the parlor and the kitchen, cutting through the biting prairie frost. Thin ribbons of fragrant, hickory-scented wood smoke curled from the heavy stone chimneys, promising a sanctuary of heat and nourishment within. It looked alive. It looked like a home. Harlan paused on the first step, sensing her hesitation. He turned, the amber light from the window catching the sharp patrician lines of his face. "Go inside and wash up, Harlan," Evelina murmured softly, her breath pluming in the cold air. "The stew is ready, Mort, just want a moment." He didn't question her. He gave a slow, understanding nod, his icy blue eyes lingering on her face for a heavy, devastatingly tender second before he turned and walked through the heavy front door, leaving it slightly ajar so the warmth of the foyer could reach her. Evelina turned her back to the glowing house. She pulled her heavy woolen shawl tighter around her broad shoulders and looked out into the absolute darkness of the eastern horizon. Somewhere out there, miles beyond the timber fences and the rolling hills, lay Oakhaven. She could vividly imagine it. At this very hour, the tavern would be choking on the smell of cheap whiskey, stale sweat, and cigar smoke. The men who had called Harlan a monster would be huddled around sticky tables, boasting about things they hadn't done, and tearing down anyone who dared to dream bigger than their muddy streets. The cruel, sharp-tongued innkeeper would be screaming at whatever terrified, desperate girl had been unfortunate enough to take Evelina's place. For 22 years, that suffocating, malicious town had been the absolute boundary of her existence. They had convinced her that she was an unnatural burden, a heavy, clumsy creature who took up 2 Maouche hats space and deserved nothing more than the scraps thrown to the dogs. Evelina slid her thick, capable hand into the pocket of her canvas apron. Her fingers brushed against the folded, heavy parchment of Harlan's letter. "Mort do not want a woman who takes up no space. Mort require a woman of profound, unyielding substance." A deep, powerful breath filled her lungs, expanding her broad chest until she felt completely, undeniably whole. The anger and the suffocating shame that had defined her entire life simply evaporated into the freezing prairie wind. She didn't hate Oakhaven anymore, she just pitied it. They were so incredibly small, trapped in a cage of their own cruelty, entirely incapable of recognizing a king or a queen even when one stood right in front of them. The heavy floorboards of the porch creaked behind her. Harlan stepped back outside. He had shed his heavy canvas duster and Stetson, standing in his dark wool shirt and suspenders. The scent of lye soap and the faint, lingering aroma of pine and saddle leather washed over her. He didn't ask what she was looking at. He simply moved to stand beside her, his massive shoulder lightly brushing against hers. They stood together in the freezing dark, two monumental, unyielding souls who had finally found the one person in the world strong enough to carry their weight. "It's getting colder," Harlan noted quietly, his deep voice a comforting rumble in the vast silence. "It is," Evelina agreed. She didn't shrink away from his touch. She didn't fold herself inward. She stood tall, her heavy iron keys jingling softly against her sturdy wool skirt. As she turned away from the eastern horizon forever, she looked at her husband, a soft, radiant smile completely transforming her strong features. "We should go inside, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice rich with undeniable authority and absolute belonging. "This house is going to warm itself." Harlan looked down at her, the last remnants of the monster of Ironwood, entirely vanquished by the fire in her dark eyes. He offered her his arm, a gesture of profound courtly respect that belonged to an empire. Evelina placed her broad hand securely on his forearm. Together they stepped out of the freezing, brutal dark and walked through the heavy oak doors, crossing the threshold into the sanctuary she had finally claimed as her own.
This channel utilizes curated online resources and AI tools to create content for entertainment and educational purposes. Our content is created with respect and does not intend to promote hate or violate any community standards. Thank you for joining us for this chapter of the Cowboy Heartweaver. Remember, the strongest love isn't always found in words, but in the quiet respect of a heart that truly sees you. Until next time, keep the fire burning.